Welcome everyone to this session of the Peace Research Colloquium hosted by Swiss Peace and the University of Basel Department of Social Sciences and Graduate School of Social Sciences. It's a great pleasure to welcome Richard Caplan from the University of Oxford as our speaker this week. I think many of you know of him or know him. Richard Caplan is Professor of International Relations at the University of Oxford, and he has written quite extensively on peace and conflict, on conflict management by international organizations, on post-conflict peace and state building. And today he will present his latest book, which came out last year with Oxford University Press, that is called Measuring Peace, Principles, Practices, and Politics. I think it touches on a question that we have discussed quite a bit already in this colloquium, which is how could we know if the peace that has been established following a war is a stable peace, and how would we measure that? So without further ado, I hand over to Richard Caplan. The floor is yours.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Dana. And it is a real pleasure to have the opportunity to present my book. And also, I'm very much looking forward to, from my standpoint, the best aspect of all this is always the opportunity for dialogue. So I'm very much looking forward to that. As Dana has indicated, the question that is at the heart of the book, which I wanted to reflect on with you today, is the following. How do we know that the peace that's been established following a civil war is a stable peace? And by stable, I mean not prone to relapse. Now, peace stability is one dimension, only one dimension of quality peace. I'll come back to that point a little later, but it is obviously a very important dimension. And why is peace stability important? Well, for this audience, I'm sure it's going to be self-evident, but nonetheless, I'll mention a number of different reasons. The first of those is the vulnerability of conflict-affected countries to conflict relapse. Now, with my colleague Anke Heffler, we looked at all internal conflicts, that is all civil wars that ended in or after 1990 until 2013, and how long the peace endured in each case. Now, for purposes of this analysis, the start of a peace spell is marked by the end of armed conflict, whether that's a military victory, a ceasefire, a negotiated settlement, or just a fizzling out of the armed conflict, and it lasts for at least a year. So this is a conventional measure of a peace spell. And in that period that we observed, 1990 to 2013, there were 210 peace spells. That is, 210 conflict episodes ended in peace that lasted for at least 1 year. Now, just to be clear, these were not 210 separate conflicts. A single conflict can have multiple conflict episodes and multiple peace spells. So this chart, which you see on the screen, depicts how many peace spells break down and when this happens. So in other words, it shows how long peace survives as measured in days. Now, in the beginning, as one would expect, all of our observations are at peace. After 2 years, 99% of all peace spells survive. That is, only 1% of all peace spells have failed and armed conflict has recurred. After 3 years, 83% of the peace spells have survived. But after 12 years, 4,380 days to be precise, only about half of the peace spells have survived. So that's a very high rate of peace failure. Indeed, if you extend the timeline between 1946 and 2013 and you focus on conflict-affected countries, not on peace spells, 105 countries suffered civil wars in that period. And of those 105 countries, more than half, 59 countries, experienced a relapse into violent conflict, in some cases more than once, after peace had been established. So that's one reason why peace stability matters, the high rate of conflict relapse or conflict recidivism. Another reason why peace stability matters is because of the cost of peacekeeping and peace building. Now here you see the cost of UN peacekeeping expenditure in the same, a longer period, 1950 to 2013. The approved budget for UN peacekeeping operations for the most recent fiscal year that ended on the 30th of June 2020 was a little lower than what you see here, $6.5 billion, but still quite significant. Now bear in mind that this is for UN peacekeeping only. It doesn't include other UN peace consolidation efforts, nor the costs associated with the efforts of other organizations. Indeed, here, additionally, are the number of regional peace operations, that is non-UN operations, in the period from 1946 to 2013. Regional organizations, especially in Africa and in Europe, have been taking on more and more responsibility for peacekeeping and peace consolidation. Okay, so then taken together, peace operation expenditure, UN and otherwise, is another reason why peace stability matters. The Peacebuilding Commission that was established in 2005 at the World Summit was established very much with this problem of conflict recidivism in mind. The concern that countries that were emerging from violent conflict were prone to falling back into conflict, and that if they were on the radar of the international community, which the peacebuilding would hope to achieve, there was a greater likelihood that peace could be consolidated in those countries. These are the 6 countries that have been placed on the Peacebuilding Commission's agenda. And the challenge the Commission's been facing, and it's a very real challenge, is when should a PBC country graduate? When should it come off the agenda? And the enabling resolution, the one that established the Peacebuilding Commission in the first place, does have an answer to that question, which is the following. The following is an excerpt from that resolution. And it says, the Commission shall terminate its consideration of country-specific situation when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established or upon the request of national authorities of the country under consideration. So basically, there are 2 ways in which a country comes off the agenda, either at the request of the country itself or when foundations for sustainable peace and development are established. But the problem is that that language really only begs the question, what are the foundations for sustainable peace and development? And the problem is that there are no hard measures or indicators of a consolidated peace. In contrast, say, to the indicators of a prosperous economy, notably certain macroeconomic fundamentals, or a healthy population, for instance, immunization rates or literacy rates, even though some of these are contentious. For instance, GDP growth as a measure of economic prosperity is something that has been challenged. But nonetheless, we do have what many people consider, by contrast, to be fairly reliable measures in other areas. But we don't have similarly hard measures or indicators of a consolidated peace. You could say the absence of armed conflict is such an indicator, but it's symptomatic of a stable peace, but it's really not in itself an indicator of a stable peace because it can change from one day to the next. So there are various ways one might approach the question of how do we know if a peace that's been established is a stable peace? And one is to determine whether the factors that are known by scholars to be responsible for the onset of civil war are present or not. And scholars have identified 3 broad classes of causes of conflict onset. The first is motivation. Motivation encompasses a wide range of often grievance-based sub-factors of and we see this reflected in work that I'm sure many of you are familiar with on relative deprivation, horizontal inequalities, ethnic insecurity. The second class of causes we might call feasibility. These stress the importance of opportunity over motivation, suggesting, for instance, that rebellion is more likely to occur where material conditions favor it, mountainous terrain, natural resources, external support. The third class of causes is resilience, which emphasizes the vulnerability of the state in question to various internal and external pressures, for instance, rising food prices or migration, and the capacity of states and their institutions to cope effectively with these pressures. Now, there are two problems with this approach. First, there's no consensus among scholars as to which factors matter or which factors matter most. Indeed, as Charles Cole has observed in his book, Why Peace Fails, there's tremendous disparity, he writes, among scholars about whether certain factors are important or not, and about the degree to which they are important. And the second problem with this approach is that it assumes that the causes of conflict onset and the causes of conflict recurrence are one and the same. Cole has done quantitative analysis, which has shown that while onset and recurrence have a number of risk factors in common, including political instability, population size, reliance on natural resources such as oil exports, there are also significant differences. I mean, for one thing, we know wars are transformative. So the root causes of a conflict may no longer pertain as a consequences of the changes that the conflict itself has brought about. For instance, population displacements or the rise of new political elites. I mean, just think about the civil war in Afghanistan from 1989 to 1992 and how it facilitated the rise of fundamentalist Muslim forces that in turn provoked a new civil war from 1992. But they were not really a significant factor at the outset of the war, going back to 1989. So causes of conflict onset is one way to think about whether peace is stable or not. But another approach is to focus not on the causes of civil war, but on the causes of peace in the aftermath of civil war. So what measures have been most successful in maintaining the peace after violent conflict, and have they been applied to the cases in question? So again, there's a range of possibilities and, not surprisingly, differences among scholars with respect to these possibilities. Scholars have stressed the importance of the nature of war termination, whether it's a military victory, for instance, or a negotiated settlement, military victories tending to result in more enduring peace. Also, whether third-party guarantees have been made available, for instance, in the form of UN peacekeepers or NATO stabilization forces, or whether the peace settlements have been inclusive, how representative. Just more broadly, the nature of the peace settlement. But again, as I said, as with the previous approach about the causes of conflict onset, there's a lack of consensus among scholars as to the effects of the measures and which measures are that would matter most. So there is recognition, nonetheless, despite these problems, of the importance of monitoring the quality of peace and the progress of peace progression, and that's represented in this quotation that's on your screen. Monitoring the progress of peace is of such obvious value in any post-conflict society that the worth of doing so is rarely, if ever, challenged. However, the means used to do so is another matter. So how do the major peace-building actors assess progress towards the achievement of a consolidated peace? How do they know whether the peace that they're working to establish is a self-sustaining one? And the fact is, they often don't monitor progress, or they don't do it well enough. Now, before I say anything about the practices that characterize assessment, I want to acknowledge that there are a lot of notable exceptions to what I'm about to say. Indeed, subsequent to this slide, I'm going to talk about some of those exceptions. And there is a growing awareness of the deficiencies of both past and current practice. However, despite the notable exceptions and lots of finely worded documents, many of the observations that I'm about to make are still, in my view, valid. So to begin with, rarely are peacebuilding organizations actually tasked with assessing the robustness of the peace that they're helping to build. And in my book, this is what I call strategic assessment. So very rarely do they have that responsibility. Reporting on developments in the field of operations, by contrast, is a widespread practice, but reporting itself is not a strategic assessment. Every head of a UN peacekeeping operation, for instance, submits formal periodic reports to the Secretary General on the situation in the country in question, often on a quarterly or a semi-annual basis. And here you have a facsimile of one of those reports. The Secretary General in turn reports on the situation to the Security Council. These reports may vary in their content, but they typically provide an overview of major developments since the last report, an evaluation of progress in the implementation of the mandate of the operation, and a discussion of the key challenges facing the country on the operation. Reporting has tended to be ad hoc and rather impressionistic. And this, by the way, comes to me by way of interviews with special representatives of the Secretary General. So this is in their own view, the kind of reporting that emerges from the field. They say that the UN Secretariat lacks a uniform understanding of the purposes of a field report and a Security Council briefing, and little guidance is provided to them in preparing them. There's a tendency to measure what can be measured easily. So for instance, the number of training sessions on human rights organized for police officers rather than their qualitative effects. For instance, how respectful the police are of human rights. In other words, a measurement of outputs rather than outcomes. And that's because, of course, it's a lot easier to measure how many people have been through a training session than it is to measure what the effect of that training session has been. The focus of a lot of these reports is on mandate implementation, and that's reasonable because these operations are tasked with certain responsibilities, and it's fair enough for the Security Council or whatever governing body to investigate the extent to which those responsibilities are being fulfilled. But mandates don't always reflect the requirements for achieving a sustainable peace. Mandates are often the fruits of political compromise. And the other problem is that these reports are often partial and not holistic, and that's partly the consequence of increasing multilateral engagement in conflict management, in peace building. The fact that there are now so many different organizations that are involved, and there's a division of labor. Very often there's no one organization that has responsibility for everything. And as a result, those organizations report on their part, their share of the larger project, if you will. And often we lose sight in those reports, therefore, of the overarching effect. So I said that there are notable exceptions, and there are, and this was, I have to say, one of the more satisfying aspects of writing the book. As scholars, we love to put our critical hats on and draw attention to weaknesses, shortcomings, and so forth. But it's also very gratifying to be able to find good practice among the wide range of practices of the organizations that one looks at. And I did find quite a lot of good practice. Of course, this practice is not necessarily representative of practice across the entire organization in question, and nor is it practice that is often shared between organizations. And so that's very unfortunate. But I did want to then just mention two in particular. The first, I've been saying a lot about the UN. I do talk about other organizations in the book, and one of them is the Organization for Security and Cooperation in Europe, the OSCE. And the OSCE, if you remember the 2008 Georgia crisis, the war in Georgia, it caught the OSCE very much off guard. And as a consequence, in 2012, 2013, the OSCE developed internal guidelines for early warning, allowing for more systematic and structured approach to the identification of potential conflicts and crisis situations. And it rolled out a conflict analysis toolkit and a set of early warning indicators for use in the organization's field operations. The toolkit and indicators together provide a framework for the systematic analysis of conflict settings at the local, regional, national, and international levels, including, but not limited to, the assessments of the robustness or the fragility of the peace established in the aftermath of violent conflict. The framework stresses the importance of appreciating the relevant contextual issues, for instance, socioeconomic and political conditions, in order to comprehend the specificities of a conflict, as well as the influence that the broader context can exert on the conflict dynamics. But by the OSCE's own reckoning, in its first year of operation, this toolkit, that is to July 2013, the OSCE Secretary General raised concerns about what he called worrying developments that threatened the peace arising from this analysis on 11 occasions with respect to the OSCE region. Now, by contrast, I just mentioned in East Timor, Timor-Leste, which has been where the UN has had a series of peacekeeping and peacebuilding operations from 1999, there was on the UN's own watch an outbreak of violence in 2006. And the interesting thing is that there, based on a study that somebody has done, there was no prior conflict analysis of Timor-Leste. So no real anticipation of the violence that was to come. And there were individuals who were, however, knowledgeable about the situation in Timor and who did actually sound the alarm. They were an isolated few individuals in different organizations, and they were operating on the basis of principles that I'll come back to at the end of my talk that gave them particular insight into the situation there. But I just mentioned this as a contrast to what was emerging anyway from some of the analysis that the OSCE was able to do. The other good practice I want to mention is UN benchmarking. Now, benchmarking is a form of evaluation you may be familiar with that uses specified standards, a value process, a state of affairs, the attainment of which is thought to contribute to the realization of an organization's or operations' broad objectives. So, for instance, the reduction and the elimination of militia threats may be a benchmark for the establishment of a secure environment. And if done properly, benchmarking can introduce greater rigor and precision into assessments and allow for monitoring peace towards achieving a stable progress towards achieving a stable peace. Now, the UN mission in Sierra Leone, UNAMSIL, which was established in October 1999 in the wake of an 8-year civil war there, was the first operation to employ benchmarking to inform decision-making about the drawdown and withdrawal of troops. And I'll just show you what those benchmarks were. These were adopted at the request of the UN Secretary General in 2002, it was decided that, among other things, the UN peacekeeping operation there would, well, more broadly be the decision to draw down and withdraw would be based primarily on the government's capacity to maintain external and internal security without international assistance, which I would say is quite a reasonable standard for a sustainable peace. So these benchmarks were drawn up. They were devised from elements of the Lomé and Abuja peace agreements and were identified as critical for the maintenance of peace. And the monitoring included tests that were conducted by the UN in each province of Sierra Leone to test the readiness and the capacity of government security forces to maintain peace and security independently. So I just highlight that the first of those several five benchmarks, to just give you a little bit of detail about how it was actually operationalized. On the basis of the examination of good practice in the book, I try to distill principles of good practice. And I discuss these in the book. I want to just mention three of them for the purposes of our discussion here. The first is what I call an ethnographic approach. Now, some of you have read Severina Althusser's outstanding book, Peaceland. She uses the term ethnographic approach as well, but in a very different sense. She uses it to describe her embedding herself in the international organizations about which she was writing, so that she has a better appreciation of the culture and the practices of those organizations. What I mean by an ethnographic approach for the purposes of what I call a strategic assessment is more greater reliance on knowledge of local culture, local history, and especially the particular conflict dynamics that are at work in a given conflict situation, including at the micro level. And Althusser does also endorse such an approach. He says, familiarity with the local context is crucial. In-depth knowledge of the local histories, cultures, traditions, attitudes, and worldviews remains critical throughout project implementation. So in those cases where there is, if you will, a finger on the pulse, a better understanding of the more accurate understanding of the robustness of the peace that's been established, it's often because there is considerable local knowledge. Many of you may know Rory Stewart in the UK. He served until recently as a member of Parliament, but also was a key actor in the so-called post-conflict reconstruction of Iraq and Afghanistan. And in the book he co-wrote titled Can Intervention Work? He was very critical of peace builders in both Iraq and Afghanistan, and drew attention especially to their lack of local knowledge, which he called a central cause of the humiliating mess in Afghanistan. And even earlier, Robert McNamara, the chief architect of the Vietnam War, the US Secretary of Defense, would later in his memoirs bemoan what he called our profound ignorance of the history, culture, and politics of the people in the area, in Vietnam. And this very gross misunderstanding led to very tragic outcomes because of the failure of the United States to appreciate sufficiently or at all that it was fighting against forces that were first and foremost engaged in a struggle for self-determination, for independence, and only really secondarily ideologically motivated in terms of socialism, communism, and certainly not part of any global communist wave that was running across the country and the region. So I've said probably too much about that, but an ethnographic approach, very important for good practice. Continual strategic assessment, also extremely important. It's important to ask whether the original objectives for peace building still support the broad strategic goals, whether there are new or unanticipated threats or impediments to a stable peace that have emerged. For instance, if there are new external security challenges or inauspicious political shifts or new political configurations in the country that have changed the dynamics of peace building, and whether that requires the articulation of new or altered objectives, has available implementing capacity, whether internationally or nationally changed, and what implications does this have for meeting an operations objectives and achieving a sustainable effort. And then the third I'll mention is the importance of incorporating local perspectives in the analysis. You saw that to some extent when I referred to the benchmarks for the drawdown of peacekeeping in Sierra Leone, reliance to some extent on the elements of the peace agreements. But this needs to be done in a much more comprehensive, systematic way. And I'll just mention the innovative work of Roger McGinty, Pamina Furcho. You may be familiar with the work that they have done on so-called everyday peace indicators, where they have used community-generated indicators to determine whether and to what extent peace has been established in conflict-affected communities, in their own communities. Now, the difficulty, of course, with local perspectives is that there is often not just one perspective. These are, of course, often polarized countries, and so there are going to be conflicting views as to what the requirements for peace are going to be. So it's very easy to say we need to consult the local community, but it's very, very difficult sometimes to put that into practice. And the last thing, just to sum up, just some concluding observations. I've been talking a lot about what I call strategic assessment, efforts to assess the robustness, the quality of the peace. I just want to stress that this is not a technical exercise. It's partly that, and when I talked about benchmarking, there are certain technical requirements involved in that. But it's very much also about normative choices. Is it better to forgive in terms of crimes that have been committed, or to forget, or to punish? These and a lot of other issues are really fundamentally normative choices, and they're going to vary from case to case. So one can't really generalize. It depends very much, again, on local circumstances and who is going to be making those decisions. And the other thing is that as much as the kinds of practices or approaches that I've been recommending can, I think, improve our understanding, strategic assessment isn't a panacea. Conflict is a very complex social phenomena, and we are victims, if you will, of what political science we call bounded rationality. There are limits to what we can know. So it's not always possible to fathom a lot of contingency, obviously, in the vicissitudes of a post-conflict country. And finally, even the best of knowledge can be trumped. I think we could still use that expression by politics, which often does prevail over other considerations there are many changes to the configurations of peace operations, including decisions to draw down and withdraw, that have very clearly been taken on the basis of political national interest. Security Council member's determination that no longer wishes to be making troop or monetary contributions to an operation, that it wants to move on and focus attention elsewhere. And they may not always be so bold as to reveal these are the considerations, but sometimes they are fundamentally what are determinative. So anyway, that's just, and to give you an idea of some of the main elements of the book. As an author, it's incumbent upon me to urge you to buy the book. I'm happy to announce that it will be coming out in paperback, but not probably for another year. So if you don't have a copy, then please urge your library to obtain a copy. And I hope that you'll read it, and I hope you'll find value in reading it. So thanks very much.